suffering is a universal fact of existence. This is the starting point of two of history's greatest psychologists, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and the ancient Indian sage known as the Buddha. Now, dwelling on suffering is often gratuitous and makes a bad situation worse, but not always to grasp human life in earnest. You must explore not only its sunny hills, but its shadowy valleys too. Nietzsche says joy cannot thrive without suffering. The two are inseparable in what he calls the economy of the soul. Painful experiences often lead to the breaking open of new springs and needs the healing of old wounds, the shedding of entire periods of the past. There is a personal necessity of misfortune. Terrors, deprivations, impoverishment, midnights, adventures, risks and blunders are as necessary for me and you as their opposites. Indeed, the path to one's own heaven always leads through the voluptuousness of one's own hell for happiness. And misfortune are two siblings and twins who either grow up together or remain small together. Nietzsche refuses to divide life in pairs of opposites. Good and evil, joy and suffering, right and wrong are to him conventional labels in the conflict of opposites. He sees a creative process of mutual nourishment in this. He joins company with Taoists and Heraclius, who we've explored in an earlier video. Nietzsche's life was marked by illness, loneliness, rejection, and ultimately insanity. Despite his misery, or perhaps because of it, he insists on the benefits of suffering in a passage obviously derived from personal experience. He writes, "Only great pain, that long, slow pain that takes its time, forces as philosophers to descend into our ultimate depths and put aside, trust everything good-natured, veiling, mild, average. I doubt that such pain makes us better, but I know that it makes us deeper." Nietzsche sees pain as a teacher to him. Misfortune provides the resistance necessary for growth of character. If one has the correct attitude, suffering can become the soil out of which joy, wisdom, and health blossom, the mud out of which the lotus rises. Nietzsche says there are two basic ways in which we may respond to suffering, to use his language. We may call them the way of the weak and the way of strong. The way of the weak is to see suffering as something that consumes us. This is the impulse to avoid pain by all means, to preserve ourselves from it, to retreat, back to safety, back into the womb, back into nothingness. If possible, Nietzsche sees this as a cowardly, ignoble response. The way of the strong, on the other hand, is to see suffering as something we consume. This is the impulse to build strength through challenge, to actively seek out discomfort. What Nietzsche sees as true nobility of spirit is the act of seeking out suffering. As he famously wrote, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." So Nietzsche says, suffering is universal, but its meaning depends on our attitude to it. For the strong, suffering is a source of strength, reassurance, and expansion. For the weak, it is a source of weakness, doubt, and shrinking. This doesn't exhaust Nietzsche's analysis. In fact, he says pleasure and pain, joy and suffering are phenomena. He sees them as byproducts of the real drive of human activity, the will to power to Nietzsche. Everything in life is driven by the impulse to discharge power in organic processes, sentient beings and society is alike. He was never too specific in his definition of the will to power, but one thing he didn't mean his brute power or political power as such. Nietzsche's example of the will to power par excellence was the artist striving always beyond himself, creating what has never been created before. And the greatest artists, Nietzsche tells us, are philosophers and religious leaders through their art. These put reins on life and define how whole generations see and experience the world. So we can see the will to power as a creative impulse of expansion and novelty. This reminds me of Wilber's evolutionary principle, transcend and include. We discussed this in a previous video for Nietzsche. What we call suffering is simply the felt experience of the will to power being restricted. And the undisturbed flow of the will to power is the feeling we've come to call joy or happiness. Now, let's relate this to the two fundamental attitudes to suffering. Remember, Nietzsche says, all of reality is the will to power in action. So both the strong and the weak response to suffering arise from this principle. The strong type receives suffering as the resistance necessary for growth. The overcoming of pain, the transformation of misfortune into fortune, this is what drives the noble one. She sees difficulty and suffering as necessary conditions for greatness. This is her will to power. In this view, only great pain is the liberator of the spirit. The weak type, on the other hand, receives suffering as an insurmountable obstacle. However, his will to power cannot simply disappear. As Nietzsche says, man would much rather will nothingness than not will. So the weak type turns the will to power against itself, as the will cannot assert itself in the world. It rejects the world, it rejects itself. Even the weak type achieves his greatness in self-annihilation. The desire to abandon desire, the effort to see its effort, the dissolution of the self. This is how the weak link asserts his will to power. Nietzsche sees this as the root of most religious traditions. We read an ascetic life is a self-contradiction, an unsatiated instinct and power will that would like to become Lord, not over something living but rather over life itself. An attempt is made here to use energy to stop up the source of the energy. Here, the gaze is directed greenly and maliciously against physiological flourishing itself. The ultimate power move of the weak is to cast their own inferiority onto existence, to label the world of the senses illusory, to see the self and the will as enemies, and to escape into an imagined world of abstract perfection. Now, what would the Buddha say to this? With his idea of nirvana, the illusory self, the overcoming of craving and the ending of rebirth is the Buddhist response to suffering. When Nietzsche goes weak and cowardly, is Buddhism an ignoble philosophy? The English words, suffering, pain, dissatisfaction, stress, discomfort, and so on, all fall under the same category in Buddhism. There are different forms of what the Buddha calls dukkha. Dukkha describes all unpleasant experience, but not only that, it also describes all experience subject to change and all experience arising due to causes and conditions, pain, impermanence, and conditionality. All lead to that background of uneasiness which underlies the human condition. It is this uneasiness dukkha that the Buddha set out to cure. He says both formerly and now it is only dukkha that I describe, and the cessation of dukkha like Nietzsche. The Buddha too does not end his analysis with the existence of suffering. He too sees dukkha as a byproduct. He says, what is the cause by which dukkha arises? Craving is the cause by which dukkha arises. In other words, it is the craving of experience that generates suffering. Craving is the ever-present drive for something more, something better, something different. Being of the nature to seek satisfaction, craving manufactures this satisfaction. Whenever it appears, as the song goes, if I was where I would be, then I'd be where I am, not here. I am where I must be where I would be. I cannot. The Buddha tells us craving not only generates suffering, it is what generates existence itself. He says, fettered with the fetter of craving, beings conjoined, go wandering and transmigrating on for a long, long time. The Buddha sees ancient beings as prisoners of endless cycles of rebirth. The force fueling these cycles is the endless appetite of craving. We've covered this before. So to what extent can we compare the Buddha's craving with Nietzsche's will to power? Thankfully, the Buddha defines his terms more carefully. He says, craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming, these are the three cravings. This overlaps neatly with Nietzsche's will to power, to crave the world of the senses, and its becoming is the creative noble expression of the will to power. To crave the non-becoming of the world is the decadent ignoble expression of the will to power. And now we've stumbled on something fascinating. Remember, from the two attitudes people can have to suffering, Nietzsche extrapolates two fundamentally different ways of life. A person responds to suffering either with the will to be or with the will not to be. The noble spirit is nourished by suffering. He seeks it out. The weak spirit is nourished by consuming himself. He seeks escape not only from pain, but from the very existence where pain is possible. This is a profound insight of the German philosopher, but it appears the Buddha was there before him. He too recognizes these two opposite approaches, the craving for becoming and the craving for non-becoming, but unlike Nietzsche, the Buddha rejects both. Instead, he opts for a middle way. This middle way is the noble W for path. This is the path of Buddhist practice, and we've explored it in previous videos. In short, this path temporarily strengthens craving for some things like enlightenment. In order to ultimately end craving itself, it combines the strategy of the weak and the strategy of the strong to achieve a shift of consciousness where there is no longer any strategy whatsoever. So Nietzsche would exclaim here, "I was right after all. The Buddha uses the will to overcome the will." He takes us into the oriental nothingness called nirvana, into me to rigid, deaf self-surrender, self-forgetting, self-extinction, the hypnotic feeling of nothingness, the rest of the deepest sleep, in short, absence of suffering. This may count already as the highest good, as value of values for those who suffer and are totally out of sorts. This must be appraised by them as positive, felt to be the positive itself. Nietzsche is clearly a psychologist with few equals, if any. But I think there is one thing he fails to account for in his analysis of Buddhism. He had no access to the Buddhist science of mind cultivation. And so he overlooked its significance, and no, I don't mean the modern varieties of meditation for stress relief. We can envy Nietzsche for being spared. Seeing these, I mean the ancient tradition of Buddhist meditation, which produces on-demand states of consciousness inaccessible to the ordinary mind. To discuss Buddhist philosophy, apart from meditation, is like discussing food, apart from its taste. In short, meditation gave the Buddha the insight that experience falls into two broad categories: the conditioned and the unconditional, or samsara and nirvana. What most of us call life is really the realm of samsara. It is the flow of experience according to causes and conditions marked by impermanence and dissatisfaction, an infinite web of relationships with no substance or essence to be found anywhere within this web. Sentient beings arise and disappear in cycles, all driven by the impulse of craving. When the Buddha teaches liberation from craving, liberation from suffering, and liberation from rebirth, he's not teaching nihilism or extinction. Of course, it would seem he is teaching that to a mind familiar only with the conditions, but Buddhist meditation reveals an altogether different kind of experience is possible. It is this second kind of experience, nirvana, that the Buddha is leading us to. He says there is that dimension where there is neither earth nor water, nor fire nor wind, neither the infinitude of space, nor the infinitude of consciousness, nor nothingness, nor perception, nor non-perception, neither this world nor the next world. And there I say there is neither coming nor going nor stasis, neither passing away nor arising. This is the end of dukkha. Nietzsche would probably dislike the negative language here. But let us for a moment assume the Buddha was right about nirvana. In fact, imagine you yourself had the experience of an eternal, unconditioned reality. Obviously, this reality would be unlike anything in ordinary experience. It would be unlike everything words were invented to describe if you wanted to communicate to others who have not had the experience. How would you do it? To compare the unconditioned with conditioned things would be misleading. The sincerest, most accurate way of describing the indescribable is to say what it is not. The only form of language that can communicate the incommunicable is negative language. And even this is ultimately misleading, as the Buddha tells one of his disciples, deep vacha is nirvana, hard to see, hard to realize, tranquil, refined beyond the scope of conjecture. Subtle to be experienced by the wise, nirvana deserves its own separate discussion, and I'll leave that for a future video. But now let's give the German philosopher his due and assume the Buddha was wrong. It is certainly not impossible that meditation is a form of self-hypnosis, and faith in nirvana is wishful thinking. This would make Buddhism a philosophy of the weak. In Nietzsche's book, he writes all preachers of morals and all theologians share one bad habit. They all try to talk people into thinking they are in a very bad way and need some severe final radical cure. This world is illusory. Consequently, there must be a world of truth. This world is conditioned. Consequently, there must be an unconditioned world. This world is contradictory. Consequently, there must be a world free from contradiction. Suffering inspires these inferences. They are wishes that such a world would exist. Hatred of a world which inflicts suffering likewise expresses itself in imagining another world a valuable one. This longing away from all appearance change, becoming death wish. Longing is itself a will to nothingness, an aversion to life, a rebellion against the most fundamental presuppositions of life, but it is and remains a will. So, is there a dimension of experience free from suffering, impermanence, and conditions, or is this a pipe dream of the weak? On this point, the whole argument hangs. This decides whether the world and suffering must be embraced or overcome. But before we rush to a conclusion, let's take a step back. Let's appreciate just how much in common Nietzsche and the Buddha have. People often overlook a key event in the Buddhist biography, that is, his mother, Maya, dies shortly after giving birth to him, legend or not. This tells us trauma has accompanied the Buddha from his very entry into life, and the loss of the mother figure, the eternal comforter, would well have motivated his search for nirvana, the end of suffering. In light of this, it is not insignificant that Nietzsche lost his father when only 4 years old. This loss of the paternal figure cannot be entirely unrelated to his most famous proclamation, the death of God. Both the Buddha and Nietzsche grew up with an intimate experience of pain. They arrived at the problem of suffering, not as disinterested intellectuals, but as heartbroken men. It just so happens, they were also geniuses. At first, both sought the cure for suffering in life, renunciation, Nietzsche in his passion for Schopenhauer and the Buddha in his practice of extreme asceticism. Both were soon disappointed. They broke with tradition and retreated into a life of seclusion, and there made their greatest discoveries. Nietzsche's kinship with the Buddha was not lost on him. He writes, Buddhism is the only genuinely positive religion to be encountered in history. It does not speak of a struggle with sin, but yielding to reality of the struggle with suffering. So before we pit Nietzsche against the Buddha, we should recognize that a truth. They are kindred spirits. Their language betrays that too. Nietzsche keeps speaking of nobility, of spirit, of the noble way of life. And what does the Buddha speak of? The Four Noble Truths. The Noble Eightfold Path. Both describe a way of life attainable for the few, opposed to popular values, requiring insight, courage, and perseverance. For both this noble way of life arises as a response to the problem of suffering. I'm stressing these parallels to make a point. Obviously, there's a lot Nietzsche and the Buddha do not agree on. But this doesn't mean we cannot learn from both. That Nietzsche and the Buddha advise different ways of responding to suffering is secondary. If you read between the lines, we see the same coalescence. That is, when we encounter suffering, we shouldn't look away tragedy and disappointment, strip away our illusions. They remind us of the impermanence, fragility, and vanity inherent in everything. This is why they are so painful, but this is why also they are a gift. Suffering is our greatest teacher. Everything trivial, vain, and artificial is burned in its fire. The greater the fire, the more gets burned away. What remains then is what is not trivial, not vain, and not artificial. Only this can resist the flames. Here, the parts of Nietzsche and the Buddha diverge. Nietzsche says, turn up the heat, let suffering forge you strong and pure, befriend the fire. On the other hand, the Buddha says, contemplate the fire, study its ways until you've learned how to put it out. There is strong disagreement here, but there is also common ground. Both Nietzsche and the Buddha encourage us to take a stance towards suffering. Suffering alone does not bring wisdom. Suffering, confronted with courage, acceptance, and curiosity, this brings wisdom. Nietzsche and the Buddha teaches the alchemy of transforming tragedy into triumph. As Nietzsche writes, a serious author is one who tells us what he has suffered and why he is now reposing in joy. The Buddha, as we've seen, couldn't agree more of his whole teaching. He says, both formerly and now it is only dukkha that I describe, and the cessation of dukkha, the noble life they both describe, constitutes finally the creative act of making joy out of suffering, light out of darkness, victory out of defeat. This is the message, this is the core agreement, but there is also the core disagreement. Is there a mode of experience free from suffering, change in conditions, or is the world of the senses? Oh, that there is the answer to this question would decide between the Buddha and Nietzsche. I would love to give you a sage's opinion here, but I am neither a sage nor do I have an opinion. The ultimate nature of experience is not to be encountered in books, lectures, or YouTube videos. The ultimate nature of experience is to be encountered within experience. If you wish to have an understanding of reality rather than a mere opinion, you must make the experiment yourself. You would be surprised how much there is to discover from simply sitting in silence and observing the breath. And yet much of what you discover will be your own projected ideas and desires. Your will to power is endlessly creative in its disguise. That is why knowing some Nietzsche will come in handy. No serious Buddhist today should spare themselves the pain and pleasure of reading Nietzsche, and no Nietzsche should scorn a little meditation practice. In both cases, one will be saved from the little trap of certainty. And who knows, perhaps once we are free of this trap, we will have new years for that timeless call of the heart. Sutra. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is no other than form. Form is no other than emptiness. Thank you for watching. I want to thank the patrons, channel members, and all others who find ways of supporting Seeker to Seeker. Your generosity allows me to continue the work. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe for more videos on the inner journey. May we all learn the craft of joy and wisdom. May we learn to see the form of emptiness and the emptiness of form. Remember, what you seek is seeking you. See you next time.